She needs psychiatric help, Your Honor. She is entirely detached from reality, and I am terrified she is going to hurt herself or someone else if we do not intervene immediately." My stepmother, Vanessa, let out a perfectly timed, breathy sob that echoed against the heavy, cold mahogany walls of the King County courtroom. She sat at the plaintiff table, her posture a master class in fabricated grief. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a monogrammed linen tissue, looking every bit the tragic, exhausted caregiver who had simply reached the end of her rope. But my eyes were not on her theatrical tears. My gaze was fixed squarely on her neck. Resting against the collar of her $2,000 designer silk blouse was a strand of vintage Mikimoto pearls, my late mother's pearls. Vanessa had dug them out of my father's safety deposit box and chosen to wear them today for one specific cruel reason. It was a calculated psychological taunt, a silent dagger aimed directly at my chest. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to scream, to leap out of my heavy oak chair, to lunge across the table and demand she take them off. She wanted to give the silver-haired magistrate sitting high above us all the visible explosive proof he needed that 24-year-old Chloe Hastings was dangerously unhinged. Before I tell you exactly how I burned her meticulously crafted narrative to the absolute ground, I have a question for you. Have you ever sat perfectly still in a freezing room while a narcissist painted you as the villain to an audience of people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever felt that suffocating, paralyzing weight as you watch them swallow a lie about you, drop by poison drop? If you know that exact agonizing feeling, hit the like button right now and tell me in the comments what state you are watching from. I want to know how many of us have had to survive this kind of betrayal. Because in that moment, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Seattle courthouse, I was entirely alone. My Aunt Martha was sitting in the gallery 2 rows behind Vanessa, nodding along with tears in her own eyes. My cousins were whispering to each other, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and fear. They were all completely under her spell, but I did not give Vanessa the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept my hands folded neatly in the lap of my cheap thrift store slacks. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I inhaled the dusty, lemon-scented air of the courtroom for 4 seconds. I held it in my lungs for 4 seconds. I exhaled for 4 seconds. I anchored my mind to the solid wood of the chair beneath me. I denied her the hysterical explosion she so desperately needed to win her case. I just sat there quiet as a ghost and watched her perform the greatest role of her life. Vanessa was a former local television news anchor who had married my father 3 years prior. She loved being on camera. She loved high society galas, but more than anything else in the world, she loved his status. My father was a brilliant, wealthy Seattle software developer who had built a massive cybersecurity empire from a tiny garage operation in the late 90s. He was a titan in the tech industry, a man whose brain moved 1,000,000 miles a minute, but whose heart was fundamentally too trusting. 8 months ago, the unimaginable happened. He died of a sudden massive heart attack in his home office overlooking the misty waters of the Puget Sound. The grief of losing my dad was a physical weight that pressed me into the floorboards for weeks. I could barely remember to drink water or turn on the lights in my apartment. But while I was drowning in the dark, trying to figure out how to simply breathe in a world without my father, Vanessa, was busy tearing his private study apart. What she found locked inside his mahogany desk absolutely enraged her. My father had updated his will 6 months before he passed. He left Vanessa the sprawling multi-million-dollar Mercer Island mansion, which was undeniably generous. But the bulk of his life's work, a massive estate comprised of $6 million in liquid assets and total controlling shares of his corporate software firm, he left entirely to me. Vanessa was not the type of woman to settle for a mere house when she felt legally and morally entitled to a kingdom. She threw a screaming fit behind closed doors, shattering a crystal vase against the fireplace, furious that she would not have her hands on the liquid cash she needed to maintain her image. But Vanessa was cunning. She knew that attempting large standard bank transfers from the estate accounts would instantly trigger automatic fraud alerts with the Internal Revenue Service and my father's team of aggressive estate lawyers. She could not just write herself a check, so she got creative. She utilized back channels to begin secretly liquidating smaller, less monitored company assets. But instead of putting them into offshore bank accounts, she funneled the cash into decentralized cryptocurrency wallets. It was a slow, methodical bleed. $10,000 here, $20,000 there. By the time the legal probate process officially started, she had already siphoned $450,000 into the digital ether. She believed it was completely untraceable to the average corporate auditor, giving her a massive secret slush fund to finance the private jets, the designer wardrobes, and the luxury vacations she refused to give up. But stealing the money was only phase 1 of her master plan. Phase 2 was far darker. Phase 2 was ensuring that if I ever woke up from my grief and noticed the missing funds, absolutely no one would believe me. To accomplish this, Vanessa launched a relentless, highly calculated gaslighting campaign designed to slowly erode my sanity and my reputation. It started small. I would leave my car keys on the kitchen counter of her house during a Sunday visit, and when I went to leave, they would be gone, only to be found 3 hours later, stuffed inside the toe of my winter boot in the hallway closet. She would hide my important mail, including my utility bills, and then act shocked when my electricity was briefly shut off for non-payment. Then she escalated. She would orchestrate entirely fabricated scenarios. She would call Aunt Martha and loudly confirm a dinner reservation for 7 o'clock on a Friday and tell me the reservation was for 9. When I showed up 2 hours late to the restaurant, flustered and confused, Vanessa would look across the table with wide, deeply sympathetic eyes. She would reach out, pat my trembling hand, and say, "Oh, Chloe, sweetheart, we talked about this 3 times yesterday. Are you feeling all right? You have been so forgetful since your father passed. My brain is starting to worry about you." She repeated these microaggressions dozens of times over 4 months. She engineered a reality where I was constantly apologizing, constantly second-guessing my own memory, and constantly appearing erratic and paranoid in front of our extended family. She was building a flawless documented history of my supposed mental decline. Her end game was insidious but terrifyingly legally sound. If she could convince a judge to officially declare me mentally incompetent and a danger to myself, she could petition the court to be appointed as my permanent legal conservator. With that legal power granted by the state of Washington, she could seize total control of the remaining $6 million estate. She could drain my father's life work completely unchecked, and I would be locked away in a private psychiatric facility in the mountains, heavily medicated and entirely silenced. Most people would have fought back the moment they realized what was happening. Most people would have yelled, hired aggressive trial lawyers, filed immediate injunctions, or screamed the truth from the rooftops at the next family gathering. But reacting emotionally is exactly what a manipulator wants. Confronting a narcissist without a mountain of airtight, irrefutable proof is exactly how you hand them the victory. If I had screamed that she was stealing crypto and hiding my keys, I would have sounded exactly like the crazy person she was telling everyone I was. So I did the exact opposite of what she expected. I leaned into the role. I played right into her perfectly manicured hands. I packed my belongings and moved out of the vibrant, expensive downtown Seattle apartment my father had helped me lease. I retreated into the shadows. I rented a dark, damp, $900 a month basement apartment in a forgotten industrial neighborhood in Tacoma. I sold my nice sedan and bought a rusted 2008 Subaru hatchback that sounded like it was coughing up a lung every time I turned the ignition. I stopped wearing makeup. I lived in oversized gray hoodies and worn-out sneakers. I showed up to Vanessa's mandatory Sunday family dinners looking pale, meek, confused, and overwhelmed. I let my hands shake when I poured my water. I let her pat my shoulder and tell my aunts and uncles how worried she was about my declining state. I gave her the exact broken victim she wanted. I made her feel so incredibly safe, so arrogant, and so powerful. But Vanessa made one massive, fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I was quiet and unassuming, I was ignorant. She told all her friends that I was just a low-level information technology help desk girl. She genuinely thought my daily job consisted of resetting employee email passwords, fixing jammed office printers, and plugging in wireless routers. She had absolutely no idea that I was actually a senior threat intelligence analyst for one of the top cybersecurity firms on the West Coast. She did not know that my specific area of expertise was penetrating dark web financial networks and tracing illicit corporate cryptocurrency laundering. I did not fix printers. I hunted digital ghosts for a living. I tracked down international cyber criminals who were 10 times smarter and 100 times more dangerous than a former local news anchor with a shopping addiction. She thought she was robbing a helpless, grieving daughter. She did not realize she had just declared war on a digital apex predator. Every single night while Vanessa drank expensive imported wine in her waterfront mansion and laughed with her high society friends, I was awake. I sat in the freezing, damp dark of my Tacoma basement, illuminated only by the harsh, blinding blue glow of my 3 massive custom-built high-resolution monitors. The relentless whirring hum of my stacked server fans was my only company. I lived on bitter, cheap energy drinks and stale crackers at 3 in the morning. My eyes burned, my back ached, and my heart constantly felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, but I never stopped typing. I mapped the complex, tangled web of the blockchain. I pulled the digital threads of the missing $450,000. I traced every single stolen fraction of a Bitcoin as it bounced across dozens of dummy wallets, through offshore proxy servers, and across international digital exchanges. She thought cryptocurrency was anonymous. She thought tumbling services erased her footprints. But the blockchain never forgets, and I am exceptionally good at making it remember. I spent thousands of hours meticulously documenting the flow of the assets, pulling metadata, capturing node relays, and methodically tying every single encrypted digital fingerprint right back to the home network she thought was completely secure. The physical reality of living a secret double life is a grueling sensory nightmare that nobody ever warns you about. While Vanessa paraded around Seattle high society playing the part of the wealthy, grieving widow, I retreated into a subterranean world of my own making. My $900 a month basement apartment in Tacoma constantly smelled of damp concrete, old copper pipes, and the sharp metallic tang of cheap energy drinks. The only source of light and heat in that miserable concrete box came from the harsh, blinding blue glare of my 3 custom-built high-resolution monitors and the relentless jet engine roar of my stacked server fans. I lived in a state of perpetual, bone-deep exhaustion. I existed on maybe 3 hours of broken sleep a night. My eyes constantly felt like they had been rubbed with crushed glass. Every single night was a brutal battle against my own heavy eyelids, but I could not stop. I had to map the digital breadcrumbs before they disappeared. It did not take me long to realize that Vanessa was absolutely not smart enough to execute a decentralized cryptocurrency laundering scheme on her own. This was a woman who regularly called the internet service provider because she could not figure out how to reset the password on her smart television. Someone else was turning the dials. Someone else was building the digital architecture to hide my father's stolen fortune. It took me 3 grueling weeks of sorting through heavily encrypted packet traffic and analyzing blockchain anomalies to finally find him. His name was Julian. He was a 32-year-old software sales representative who wore too much expensive cologne aggressively networked on professional social media platforms and leased luxury sports cars he could not actually afford. More importantly, he was Vanessa's secret boyfriend. They had been seeing each other for at least a year before my father passed away. Julian had set up what is known in the advanced cybersecurity world as a crypto tumbling service. It is essentially a massive, highly complex digital blender. He took the $450,000 he stole from my father's corporate estate accounts and shattered it into thousands of microscopic digital pieces. He then mixed those tiny fractions of Bitcoin with thousands of other random, unrelated transactions on the dark web, scrambling the data so thoroughly that it becomes nearly impossible to track the original source. After the money was sufficiently scrambled, he reassembled it and deposited it into brand new, completely anonymous digital wallets. Julian was incredibly arrogant. He assumed he had committed the perfect untraceable financial crime. He assumed I was just a grieving 24-year-old girl who would look at a complex financial bank statement, see the word blockchain, and immediately give up crying. But sheer arrogance always leaves a trail. Julian made the one fatal mistake that every overconfident amateur hacker eventually makes. He got lazy. In his desperate rush to set up a secondary routing server to handle the massive influx of stolen cash, he reused an old obscure administrator username from a defunct online video gaming forum he frequented in his early 20s. It was a tiny microscopic thread, but it was all I needed. I pulled that thread. The old gaming username was linked to an outdated recovery email address, which was linked to a forgotten cloud storage account, which continuously logged his current static internet protocol address every time his phone connected to the wireless network. I sat in my freezing basement wrapped in an oversized fleece blanket and watched the tumbling server bounce its final sanitized payout directly to an internet protocol address registered to a luxury high-rise condominium in the wealthiest zip code in Bellevue. I immediately pulled the county property records and cross-referenced them with the digital transaction ledgers. Julian and Vanessa had leased a massive penthouse with a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Seattle skyline. They had paid for the entire 12-month lease up front using the exact cryptocurrency they had stolen from my father. I hacked into the retail delivery databases and downloaded their digital receipts. Custom Italian leather sofas, 85-inch flat-screen televisions, imported marble dining tables, and first-class plane tickets to an exclusive 5-star beach resort in Cabo San Lucas. They were living a honeymoon financed entirely by my dead father, laughing at how easily they had destroyed my life. While they were busy picking out high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets for their stolen penthouse, Vanessa was aggressively accelerating her public campaign to destroy my credibility. The subtle microaggressions evolved into full-blown, undeniable character assassination. She started leaving highly dramatic, breathy, tearful voicemails on my Aunt Martha's answering machine. I know this because Aunt Martha accidentally played one out loud while trying to figure out how to use the speakerphone function on her smartphone during a Sunday dinner. The entire dining room went dead silent as Vanessa's voice filled the air. Her tone trembled with perfectly practiced maternal panic. She told my aunt that I was pacing the hallways of her house at all hours of the night, talking to people who were not there and hearing aggressive voices coming from inside the walls. She painted a picture of a girl who was completely losing her grip on reality, begging Aunt Martha for advice on how to get me committed for my own safety. The effect of her performance was immediate, sweeping, and devastating. The extended family, fully manipulated by Vanessa's calculated vulnerability and weaponized tears, slowly stopped calling me. My cousins, who used to invite me out for coffee and hiking every single weekend, suddenly became incredibly busy with work. During the rare mandatory family gatherings I forced myself to attend to maintain my cover, the room would go completely silent the moment I walked through the front door. They looked at me not with familial love, but with a sickening mixture of deep pity and genuine, uncomfortable fear. I became a walking ghost in my own family. The psychological toll of that intense isolation was immense. I fought crashing, suffocating waves of anxiety every single day. There were nights I lay completely flat on the cold concrete floor of my Tacoma apartment, staring at the brown water stains on the ceiling, violently shaking, actually wondering if I was losing my mind. Gaslighting is a terrifyingly effective weapon. If enough people you love treat you like you are completely crazy, your own brain starts to believe them. You start questioning your own memories. You start wondering if maybe you really are broken. But every time I felt like giving up, I looked at the scrolling green code on my monitors. I knew that if I broke down, if I confronted them, and screamed the truth without a titanium vault of undeniable proof, Vanessa would win. She would take everything my father built. Then came the masterstroke, the move that ultimately forced me into that freezing King County courtroom. Vanessa officially filed the emergency conservatorship petition with the probate court. As part of her emergency filing, she submitted a piece of digital evidence that physically knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. It was an audio recording, a voice memo supposedly recorded by my father just weeks before he died. I remember sitting at my desk, my hands trembling uncontrollably, my heart hammering against my ribs as I clicked play on the court-filed document. It was my dad's voice, the exact same deep, rumbling, comforting baritone that used to read me bedtime stories and teach me how to ride a bicycle. He was supposedly leaving a private voicemail for Vanessa, expressing deep, heartbreaking concern about my rapidly declining mental state. He said I was becoming horribly unstable, that he was terrified to leave his software company in my hands, and that he needed Vanessa to promise she would take care of me and manage the estate when he was gone. It sounded completely terrifyingly real. For exactly 60 seconds, I completely shattered. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed so hard I choked. The pain of hearing his voice saying those horrible things about me felt like a physical knife twisting in my stomach. But then the grief receded, and the senior threat intelligence analyst inside me woke up. I dragged the audio file into my editing software and ran it through a high-level spectrogram analysis. I stripped away the background noise and looked at the raw visual data of the sound waves. My father's voice was completely devoid of natural respiratory pauses. There were no microscopic sounds of breath intake, no natural lip smacks, no subtle vocal cord hesitations. The background noise floor was perfectly artificially flat. There were microscopic, jagged digital artifacts scattered throughout the high-frequency ranges that do not exist in human speech. It was an artificial intelligence deepfake. Julian had used a highly sophisticated, commercially available voice cloning software model, feeding it hours of my father's old, publicly recorded corporate keynote speeches to generate a script Vanessa had written herself. To solidify the fake audio, Vanessa also included a fabricated psychological evaluation in the court filing. The official-looking document was signed by a telehealth therapist who boldly diagnosed me with severe schizophrenia and an absolute inability to care for myself. It took me exactly 14 minutes of cross-referencing public university alumni records to discover that this supposedly impartial medical professional was an old college fraternity brother of Julian's from their hard-partying days at a state university in Pullman. For the next 2 weeks, I did not sleep. I existed purely on a potent cocktail of adrenaline and righteous, white-hot fury. I compiled a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier on a high-speed military-grade tablet. I cross-referenced every single blockchain ledger, every routing server log, every piece of metadata, every digital receipt, and every internet protocol address. I built an inescapable, mathematically flawless digital cage around Vanessa Julian and their fake doctor. I organized the incredibly complex data so perfectly, so methodically, making it so undeniably clear that even a first-year law student could understand the magnitude of the fraud. I placed the locked tablet inside my cheap, scuffed thrift store briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. Now I felt its solid, heavy edge resting comfortably against my knuckles as I sat in the courtroom, listening to Vanessa weep her crocodile tears to the judge. My heart rate was a steady, perfectly calm 60 beats per minute. I let her spin her pathetic web of lies, watching the gallery nod in sympathy, waiting for the precise, perfect second she finished weaving her own completely inescapable noose. The fabricated, deep, rumbling voice of my deceased father filled the heavy silence of the King County courtroom. Mr. Sterling Vanessa's high-priced, incredibly arrogant defense attorney stood next to a sleek silver laptop, letting the artificial intelligence-generated audio file play for the entire room. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than the rusted 2008 Subaru I had been driving for the past 4 months. He let the audio echo against the mahogany walls, letting the fake despair in my father's cloned voice wash over the gallery. My Aunt Martha gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. My cousin stared at the floor, absolutely horrified. Vanessa lowered her head, her shoulders shaking in a perfectly choreographed display of overwhelming grief. Mr. Sterling paused the recording and turned dramatically toward the bench. His voice was thick with manufactured sympathy. "Your Honor, it is devastatingly clear from this recording, left by the late Robert Hastings himself just weeks before his tragic passing, that the respondent's mental decline is not a recent development. Chloe Hastings is completely unable to manage a $6 million estate. She is currently residing in a dilapidated basement, isolating herself from her loving family and suffering from severe documented delusions. We are formally requesting immediate appointment of Mrs. Vanessa Hastings as permanent conservator to save this poor girl from herself before the family legacy is entirely squandered." Judge Hayes looked over the top of her reading glasses. She was a stern, silver-haired magistrate in her late 60s who possessed the weary, hardened face of a woman who had spent 30 years listening to people lie under oath. She adjusted her black robes, her expression entirely unreadable. "Miss Hastings," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a steel blade, "these are incredibly grave allegations. Your stepmother is petitioning to strip you of your legal autonomy, claiming you are entirely unable to care for yourself or manage your finances. Furthermore, she has provided medical documentation and audio evidence to support her claims." How do you respond? The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. Aunt Martha held her breath. Mr. Sterling clicked his expensive pen. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes wide, waiting for the hysterical breakdown she had spent the last 4 months trying to engineer. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry. They wanted the helpless, broken, paranoid little girl Vanessa had been describing to everyone. I stood up slowly. I buttoned the single button of my cheap thrift store blazer. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at the gallery. I looked directly across the aisle at Vanessa. I held her gaze for exactly 5 full seconds without blinking. In behavioral psychology, that is known as a dominance display. It is what you do when you want an aggressive predator to know deep in their bones that you are absolutely not afraid of them. Then I broke the silence. My voice was completely steady, perfectly modulated, and devoid of any emotion. "I am listening, Your Honor," I said, turning my attention to Judge Hayes. I just wanted to make absolutely sure my stepmother and her counsel were completely finished. I would not want to interrupt them while they are still speaking on the official court record under the penalty of perjury. Vanessa's lower lip twitched. It was a microscopic, split-second physical reaction, but I saw it. She felt the ground beneath her designer heels begin to shift. She did not know why yet, but the primal manipulative part of her brain recognized that something was horribly wrong. Mr. Sterling recovered instantly, his arrogance shielding him from the reality of the situation. "Your Honor, we have presented clear, undeniable evidence of severe cognitive decline and financial neglect. If that is not evidence of immediate incapacity, I truly do not know what is." I let his pompous words hang in the air for 3 seconds, letting the room settle. Then I picked up the heavy black military-grade encrypted tablet from my table. "May I approach the bench, Your Honor?" I asked. Judge Hayes gave a single curt nod. I walked forward and placed the tablet gently on the elevated wooden desk in front of her. I typed in the complex 16-character decryption key, unlocking the device. "I am not delusional, Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every single person in the gallery could hear me. "I am entirely aware of my surroundings, my finances, and my reality. But my stepmother is completely delusional if she honestly thought a senior cybersecurity expert would not notice almost $500,000 moving across the blockchain." Behind me, the courtroom erupted in a low, confused murmur. I did not turn around, but I knew exactly what Vanessa was doing. Her face had gone completely pale, and her right hand had instinctively flown up to grip the vintage Mikimoto pearl necklace resting against her throat. Her knuckles were white. I leaned forward, guiding the judge's eyes to the incredibly detailed, color-coded digital dossier displayed on the glowing screen. "For the past 4 months, my stepmother has claimed that I am financially incompetent," I continued. "But the truth is, I have been quietly tracking a massive, highly sophisticated corporate embezzlement scheme. Over the last 8 months, exactly $450,000 has been systematically siphoned from my late father's estate accounts. My stepmother did not report this money missing because she is the one who stole it. Mr. Sterling leaped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. This is a desperate paranoid fabrication from a deeply unwell young woman. This so-called evidence is nothing but incomprehensible techno-babble designed to confuse the court." Judge Hayes slammed her wooden gavel down the sharp crack, silencing him instantly. "Mr. Sterling, you will sit down and remain silent until I instruct you otherwise. The respondent has the floor." She turned back to me, her eyes locked onto the screen. "Continue, Miss Hastings." I tapped the screen, opening the first folder. These are the encrypted digital ledgers known as transaction hashes pulled directly from the public blockchain, I explained calmly. You will see 47 separate financial transfers moving from the estate's corporate holdings into a series of anonymous, decentralized digital wallets. My stepmother utilized a dark web cryptocurrency tumbling service to obscure the destination of these funds. I paused, turning slightly to look at Vanessa. She was breathing heavily, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. However, the person she hired to launder the money made a fatal networking error. I continued, my voice echoing off the walls. He accidentally linked his routing server to an active cloud storage account. That connection provided me with a continuous log of his static internet protocol addresses. I tapped the screen again, pulling up a map geolocation graphic. Every single one of those stolen, laundered digital coins eventually deposited into a final wallet, operated from a luxury high-rise condominium in Bellevue. I cross-referenced those digital logs with King County property records. That specific penthouse is currently leased jointly by Vanessa Hastings and a 32-year-old software sales representative named Julian. I turned fully to face Vanessa now. "Would you like to tell the judge who Julian is, Vanessa? Or should I?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked exactly like a fish pulled out of the ocean, gasping for air in an environment she no longer controlled. "Julian is my stepmother's romantic partner," I said to the courtroom. "A relationship that began well over a year before my father suffered his fatal heart attack. In this dossier, Your Honor, you will find digital receipts for designer furniture, 85-inch televisions, and first-class plane tickets to Mexico, all purchased using the exact cryptocurrency stolen from my family's trust." The gallery behind me was completely silent. It was not the uncomfortable, pitying silence from 20 minutes ago. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a room full of people who were aggressively recalculating every single thing they thought they knew. Aunt Martha was openly weeping, but she was not looking at Vanessa anymore. She was staring at me, her face pale with overwhelming shock and sudden crushing shame. Mr. Sterling was sweating profusely. Dark patches were blooming under the arms of his expensive charcoal suit. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous arrogant authority. "This data, this is illegally obtained. This has not been authenticated by a certified forensic. I am a certified forensic threat intelligence analyst." I interrupted smoothly, looking directly at him. "I build federal digital fraud cases for a living, and I am not finished." I tapped the tablet one final time, opening the last, most damning file. "The audio recording submitted to this court today, the one supposedly featuring my deceased father, is a complete fabrication," I stated clearly. I ran a high-level spectrogram analysis on the audio file provided in the court discovery packet. The visual data clearly shows 0 natural human respiratory pauses and contains artificial digital artifacts consistent with commercially available voice cloning software. Mr. Sterling went completely rigid. He knew exactly what was coming. Furthermore, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute weight of a hammer. The embedded metadata inside the digital audio file proves that this deepfake was rendered and saved exactly 3 weeks after my father passed away. It is physically impossible for a dead man to leave a voicemail. I looked back at Judge Hayes. But the most important piece of data, Your Honor, is the digital receipt tied to the software license used to create that fake recording. I traced the purchase order back to its originating network. I turned slowly, locking eyes with Mr. Sterling. The software used to artificially clone my dead father's voice was purchased using a corporate credit card registered to the physical address of Mr. Sterling's private law firm. The courtroom exploded. It was a cacophony of gasps, angry whispers, and shifting chairs. Aunt Martha let out a loud, horrified cry. Mr. Sterling literally stepped backward, physically putting distance between himself and Vanessa at the defense table. His mouth hung open. His professional career, his license to practice law, and his freedom were disintegrating before his very eyes. He had assumed he was helping a wealthy widow swat away a pesky, mentally unstable stepdaughter. He had absolutely no idea his client had just dragged him headfirst into a massive, multi-million-dollar federal cybercrime conspiracy. Vanessa completely lost her mind. The perfectly manicured, tragic widow persona evaporated into thin air, replaced by cornered, feral panic. "She is lying," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is a hacker. She is hacking my personal accounts. She planted that money. I do not even know how to use Bitcoin. She is trying to frame me for the money she lost." Judge Hayes raised her hand, her eyes flashing with absolute fury. But Vanessa could not stop spiraling. She had lost control of the narrative, and she was trying to claw it back using pure volume. "She is crazy. You have to lock her up. She has been sneaking into my penthouse. That is how she knows about the furniture. She is stalking us." I just stood there perfectly still, letting her scream. I did not need to say another word. In her desperate blind panic to accuse me of stalking her, she had just aggressively confirmed on the official court record that she did in fact live in the luxury Bellevue penthouse with Julian, and that she knew exactly what missing money I was talking about. Two thieves sitting in a sinking boat, and neither of them knew how to swim. Judge Hayes picked up her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "Order in this court!" Judge Hayes roared, her voice echoing with the absolute terrifying authority of a magistrate who had just been deeply insulted in her own domain. She did not even bother to look at Mr. Sterling, who was practically hyperventilating next to his client, frantically wiping cold sweat from his pale forehead with a shaking, manicured hand. The judge fixed her steely, unwavering gaze entirely on Vanessa, who had frozen mid-scream, her jaw hanging slack as she finally realized the catastrophic, inescapable magnitude of her own terrified words. The silence that followed the heavy crack of the wooden gavel was suffocating, thick and heavy, with the undeniable reality of a titanium trap snapping entirely shut. This court finds absolutely zero evidence of mental incapacity, cognitive decline, or financial neglect on the part of the respondent. Chloe Hastings, Judge Hayes, said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm, razor-sharp and measured tone that sent a visible shiver down the spine of every single person sitting in the gallery. The petition for emergency and permanent conservatorship is vehemently denied with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the highly compelling, meticulously organized digital forensics presented in this courtroom today, and the petitioner's own hysterical admission of knowledge regarding the stolen corporate assets, this court is immediately referring this matter to the highest federal authorities. Judge Hayes turned her attention to the large armed county bailiff standing near the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the room. "Bailiff, you will lock the doors to this courtroom right now. Nobody leaves. You are to immediately contact the Seattle field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Crimes Division, as well as the King County District Attorney. Tell them to send their financial fraud units to this courthouse immediately. We have substantial, overwhelming evidence of interstate wire fraud, federal identity theft, massive corporate embezzlement, and aggravated perjury committed in my courtroom today." She looked back down from her elevated bench, staring directly at Vanessa, whose face had completely drained of all color, making her look like a hollow, terrified ghost. "Mrs. Hastings, I strongly suggest you sit down, fold your hands, and remain completely silent until federal agents arrive to take you into custody." And Mr. Sterling Judge Hayes continued, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I highly recommend you contact independent, high-powered criminal defense counsel immediately. You are no longer acting as an attorney in this room. You are now a primary suspect in a multi-million-dollar federal cybercrime conspiracy, and I will personally see to it that the State Bar Association strips you of your license by the end of the week." I stood there for a moment, letting the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the victory wash over me. I slowly reached out, picked up my heavy, military-grade encrypted tablet, placed it gently back into my scuffed, cheap thrift store briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp, metallic click of the latches echoed in the silent room. My hands were not shaking anymore. My heart rate was a perfectly steady, rhythmic beat. I felt the exact way a marathon runner feels crossing the finish line after running completely uphill in the freezing dark for 4 agonizing, soul-crushing months. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, drained to the very marrow of my bones, but my mind was crystalline sharp and brilliantly clear. The suffocating nightmare was finally permanently over. As the courtroom slowly dissolved into a chaotic, buzzing hive of panicked whispers, and the bailiff spoke rapidly into his radio, my Aunt Martha slowly stood up from her wooden bench in the gallery. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps heavy and hesitant. Her face was streaked with running expensive mascara and fresh, devastating tears. Her hands were violently trembling as she reached out, desperately wanting to touch my arm but stopping just a few inches away. "Chloe, sweetheart." She sobbed, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her own profound guilt and shame. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. She told us such horrible, convincing things. She cried on the phone to me for hours. She swore on your father's grave that you were a danger to yourself, that you were hearing voices. Why did you not just tell us she was stealing? Why did you let your own family think you were losing your mind? Why did you suffer all alone in that horrible basement?" I looked at my aunt, feeling a strange, hollow, and detached sense of absolute peace. I was not angry with her anymore. I had spent countless hours in therapy and endless nights reading forensic psychology texts, learning exactly how predators operate. Narcissists do not just manipulate their targeted victims. They must aggressively manipulate the entire audience around the victim. They build an alternate reality, a perfectly constructed, suffocating illusion that is so incredibly convincing, so emotionally manipulative that even good, intelligent, well-meaning people get completely trapped inside it. "Because I needed you to believe her Aunt Martha," I replied softly, my voice completely steady as I took a small, deliberate step back from her reach. "If you had doubted her for even a single second, if she had sensed even a fraction of suspicion from the family, she would have instantly changed her entire plan. She would have moved the money into offshore accounts I could not reach. She needed a completely compliant, sympathetic audience nodding along to her lies. That was the absolute only way she would ever feel arrogant and safe enough to submit a forged, federally illegal document to a judge under oath. I did not need her to just be exposed as a liar to the family. I needed her to be a convicted federal felon. I needed to destroy her ability to ever hurt anyone else again." Aunt Martha stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe, terror, and deep, lingering sadness, finally realizing the immense, terrifying psychological burden I had carried entirely by myself to protect my father's legacy. The immediate aftermath of that morning in the King County Courthouse was a whirlwind of aggressive federal law enforcement action. 30 days later, the massive, meticulously organized digital evidence dossier I had compiled led to a heavily coordinated, early morning tactical raid on the Bellevue luxury penthouse. I was sitting in a sterile, brightly lit conference room at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Seattle, drinking awful black coffee, when the lead cybercrimes agent walked in and told me they had successfully breached the apartment. According to the agents, Julian, the arrogant 32-year-old software sales representative who thought he could outsmart a senior threat intelligence analyst, was pulled out of his custom Italian leather bed in his expensive silk underwear, completely sobbing and begging for his mother as they placed him in heavy steel handcuffs. Vanessa was found hiding inside her massive custom-built walk-in closet, clutching a rack of designer dresses, screaming hysterically that her life was ruined. Vanessa and Julian were both formally indicted by a federal grand jury on 12 separate devastating criminal counts. The charges included conspiracy to commit international money laundering, multiple counts of federal wire fraud, felony identity theft, computer intrusion, and aggravated perjury. Mr. Sterling, the arrogant lawyer who had assumed I was just a crazy, helpless little girl, was indicted entirely separately on 3 severe counts, including evidence tampering and conspiracy to defraud an estate. He was immediately publicly disgraced, his assets were frozen, and he was permanently stripped of his license to practice law in the state of Washington, his entire career destroyed by his own blind, greedy arrogance. The federal authorities swiftly seized the massive Bellevue luxury penthouse, impounded the leased sports cars, and tagged all the designer furniture for asset forfeiture. Working directly alongside the government cyber division, I provided the necessary complex decryption keys and routing logs required to freeze the anonymous digital cryptocurrency wallets. It took 3 weeks of relentless coding and legal maneuvering, but we successfully clawed back every single stolen, laundered cent, depositing all $450,000 right back into my father's corporate estate trust. Vanessa was left completely and utterly destitute. She was stripped of the artificial glamour, the stolen money, the high society friends, and the false reputation she had valued far above basic human decency. Knowing she could not possibly win against a mountain of flawless, mathematically irrefutable digital forensics, and terrified of spending decades behind bars, Vanessa eventually broke down and took a restrictive plea deal to avoid a devastatingly long, highly publicized federal trial. Standing in the courtroom on the day of her sentencing, stripped of her designer clothes and wearing a standard-issue oversized orange jumpsuit, she looked incredibly small. She was sentenced to 5 hard years in a secure federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. Julian, ever the selfish coward, completely turned on Vanessa, providing the federal prosecutors with every single detail of her original manipulation in exchange for a slightly shorter sentence. He received 36 months in federal lockup, though his professional reputation in the lucrative tech industry was permanently, irreversibly annihilated. No software company in the world would ever hire a convicted cyber thief. On the exact day Vanessa's remaining personal assets were officially seized and cataloged by the state, I submitted a formal legal request to the district attorney's office to reclaim my late mother's vintage Mikimoto pearls. When the authorities finally handed them back to me in a sterile, clear plastic evidence bag, I immediately drove straight to a professional high-end jeweler in downtown Seattle. I had the delicate pearls meticulously cleaned, professionally restrung on fresh silk and polished until they glowed with a soft, warm iridescence. Standing in front of the jeweler's mirror, feeling the heavy, cold clasp click securely against the back of my neck, I felt a quiet, profound reclamation of my family's true legacy. They were no longer a symbol of my stepmother's cruel taunts. They were a permanent physical reminder of my own absolute victory. I refused to stick around and listen to the tearful, endless, repetitive apologies from the extended family members who had so easily and willingly abandoned me when things got difficult. I did not owe them absolution for their profound lack of faith. I chose instead to set strict, unbreakable personal boundaries, entirely cutting ties with anyone who had chosen to believe a comfortable theatrical lie over my painful, quiet truth. Aunt Martha tried to call me several times, but I simply let it ring. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but protecting your peace from people who failed to protect you is an absolute necessity. With the massive estate fully secured and entirely under my legal control, I began the long, beautiful process of completely rebuilding my life from the ground up. I immediately sold the massive, empty Mercer Island house, refusing to keep a home tainted by Vanessa's toxic presence. I liquidated a significant portion of my father's corporate software company shares at a massive, incredibly lucrative premium to a rival tech conglomerate. I used a very large piece of that newly acquired capital to establish a fully funded permanent university scholarship program in my father's name. I specifically designed the financial endowment to help young, underprivileged women enter the incredibly demanding, male-dominated and high-stakes field of advanced cybersecurity and digital forensics. My father had always believed that brilliant minds could come from anywhere, and I wanted to ensure his legacy was actively opening massive doors for brilliant girls who just needed a chance to prove themselves. I packed up my few belongings, broke the lease on the dark, damp, miserable Tacoma basement apartment, and purchased a breathtaking, sunlit, high-ceiling luxury loft right in the vibrant heart of downtown Seattle. The new space had massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that let the golden morning sunlight pour across the warm hardwood floors. It constantly smelled of fresh pine ocean air and expensive roasted coffee, completely replacing the suffocating smell of damp concrete and fear that had haunted me for months. I also knew I needed companionship, but not from people who could betray me. I drove out to a specialized animal rescue shelter and adopted a retired three-legged police tracking dog. He was a massive, incredibly goofy, fiercely loyal German shepherd who had lost his front leg in the line of duty. I ironically named him Glitch. He was loud, clumsy, and absolutely perfect. He represented exactly what I felt inside, missing a few pieces, permanently scarred by past trauma, but still completely capable of moving forward and fiercely protecting what belonged to him. Using my newfound massive financial freedom, I formally resigned from my demanding corporate intelligence job. I took my expertise and launched my own highly specialized boutique, digital forensics consulting firm. I dedicated my entire business specifically to helping elderly, confused, and highly vulnerable victims track down and completely recover life savings and physical assets stolen from them by fraudulent, manipulative family members and sophisticated online scammers. I took the absolute worst, most agonizing experience of my entire life and forged it into a powerful, razor-sharp weapon to protect people who could not protect themselves. On the exact one-year anniversary of my beloved father's sudden death, I loaded Glitch into the back of my brand new, incredibly safe and reliable sports utility vehicle. We drove out of the bustling city to the small, quiet, perfectly manicured cemetery overlooking the misty gray waters of the Puget Sound. The wind was blowing gently off the water, carrying the sharp, clean scent of sea salt and ancient cedar trees. I sat down on the soft, damp green grass right between the smooth granite headstones belonging to my mother and my father. Glitch laid his heavy head across my lap, letting out a soft, contented sigh. I sat there for a very long time, just talking to them. I told my dad all about the massive university scholarship, about how many brilliant young women were already applying. I told him about the massive success of my new consulting company and about my ridiculous, wonderful three-legged dog. And then for the very first time since this entire horrific ordeal began, I finally dropped my heavy, stoic armor. I allowed myself to completely break down. I put my face in my hands and I wept. I cried until my chest physically ached. But I did not cry out of the suffocating, paralyzing fear that used to keep me awake at 3 a.m. I did not cry out of the deep, agonizing grief of missing my parents. I cried out of the immense, overwhelming, beautiful relief of knowing that I had stood my absolute ground in the darkest, most terrifying moments of my entire life. and I had successfully protected absolutely everything they had built for me. I had faced down a monster, and I had won. Looking back at the smoldering wreckage of those incredibly chaotic, deeply traumatizing months, I have come to realize something truly profound about the fundamental nature of human resilience. True strength is rarely loud. When you are forced to share a table with someone who is actively maliciously trying to dismantle your reality, the natural, overwhelming human instinct is to scream. You desperately want to defend yourself. You want to slam your hands on the table and demand that the entire world instantly see the truth. You want immediate, loud vindication. But as you grow older, and as the deep scars of profound betrayal slowly heal into quiet wisdom, you begin to understand that reacting emotionally is exactly what highly toxic, manipulative people rely on. They feed off your frantic panic. They weaponize your desperate need to be understood. They construct an elaborate alternate reality and then simply wait for you to completely exhaust yourself, trying to break through the thick, suffocating glass of their lies. I learned the incredibly hard way that peace is absolutely not something you are simply handed by the universe. It is something you must meticulously, painstakingly build, often entirely in the dark, while everyone else around you is sleeping comfortably. When I was sitting in that freezing Tacoma basement tracking digital ghosts across the globe and actively questioning my own sanity, I felt incredibly desperately small. There were countless nights I genuinely wanted to give up. There were moments of profound weakness where I thought maybe it would be so much easier to just let my stepmother win, to let her take the millions of dollars and control the narrative if it just meant I could finally stop fighting and get some sleep. But life inevitably teaches you that running away from a dedicated manipulator only gives them more territory to conquer. You absolutely cannot negotiate with someone who views your total destruction as their personal success. The most profound, life-altering lesson I took away from that freezing King County courtroom was not about the complex mechanics of the state legal system, nor was it about the brilliant intricacies of advanced digital forensics. It was about the terrifying, quiet, absolutely unstoppable power of extreme patience. Real, lasting justice does not always come with immediate validation from the people around you. In fact, it rarely does. Sometimes the people you love the most will eagerly choose to believe the most comfortable, well-acted lie over the most painful, glaring truth. You have to find a way to forgive them for their profound blindness while simultaneously, aggressively protecting your own mental peace. You have to be deeply, fundamentally willing to be the villain in someone else's completely fabricated story for a little while, trusting entirely that the truth possesses its own undeniable, inescapable gravity. Lies require constant maintenance, constant energy, and constant performance. The truth requires absolutely nothing. It simply waits. If you ever find yourself trapped in a terrifying situation where your fundamental reality is being violently distorted by someone who smiles warmly to your face while plotting maliciously behind your back, you must remember this one crucial, life-saving strategy. Do not ever interrupt them while they are making a mistake. Let them build their fragile, pathetic house of cards as high as they want. Let them perform their tragic acts for the cheering crowd. Keep your head down, guard your emotions like a fortress document, absolutely everything with cold clinical precision, and fiercely protect your energy. The truth absolutely does not need to scream in order to be heard. When the exact right time finally comes, you will not need to argue, you will not need to yell, and you will not need to plead for anyone to believe you. You will simply walk into the room, lay the cold, hard, irrefutable facts on the table, and calmly watch as the immense weight of their own massive deception brings their entire pathetic facade crashing down to the floor. In the end, The most devastating, truly beautiful revenge you can ever possibly exact upon a person who desperately tried to destroy you is to simply survive them, brilliantly outsmart them, and go on to live a remarkably successful, wildly happy, and completely unapologetic life. If this powerful story resonated deeply with you today, or if you have ever had to quietly, painfully rebuild your own life after a narcissist tried to tear it down to the foundation, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. Leave a comment down below sharing your own personal experiences with overcoming highly toxic, manipulative situations. Tell me how you found your own quiet strength, and please hit the like button so we can continue bringing these incredibly important stories of survival, resilience, and ultimate satisfying justice to people who desperately need to hear them.